Good morning, and to some of you, I imagine, good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to day 2 of the AVERT, Violent Extremism at the Crossroads Research Symposium. My name is Julian Drugan. There are a series of panels planned for today, spanning a host of emerging areas of research and concern. I hope that many of you will join us for some of those panels and indeed for the day. Now, we're coming together this morning from around Australia and indeed from around the world. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, their connections to the land, to sea, and also to community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and also emerging. And we also pay respect and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Now, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker this morning. We have with us Professor Maura Conway, one of the leaders in research on the interface between terrorism and the internet. Maura is the Paddy Moriarty Professor of Government and International Studies at Dublin City University. She is also the Professor of Cyber Threats at Swansea University. And last but by no means least, Maura is also the coordinator of that invaluable resource, the Voxpol program. If you haven't visited that website, I strongly recommend that you do so. Now, I'm sure that many of you are well aware of Maura's work that spans not only empirical contributions to our understanding of how terrorists and violent extremists interact with the internet, and also with social media, but also the work she's done that is foundational and conceptual and that explores those deep relationships between violent extremists and the digital environments that they inhabit and that they exploit. This morning, Maura will be asking a suitably big question for us all to start the day, one that is close to my own research interests, and that question is, what can terrorism studies learn from internet studies? Maura, welcome. It's absolutely lovely to have you. We're all very much looking forward to your address.
Good afternoon, good morning, I guess, Australia, good afternoon, USA, and good night, Europe, I guess. Hi, Julian. Also, thanks very much for your kind introduction. Thanks to Michele and everybody at AVERT for having me. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak to everybody. I'm just going to keep saying to speak to everybody tonight. Exactly as you said, Julian, what I want to talk about today is something that I've been thinking about for a while now, and that is just leave things for I hope everybody can see that screen. So something that I've been thinking about for a while now, which is what terrorism studies can learn from internet studies. By way of introduction, I guess in terms of O being for outreach, it's also for open access. So another thing close to my heart. So some time ago now in 2017, I published an article that made sort of 6 suggestions for progressing research into online extremism and terrorism. Number 5 in terms of those suggestions was outreaching beyond terrorism studies. And I guess I had sort of 2 kinds of outreach in mind here, if you like. One was with regard to outreaching to and collaborating with colleagues in other disciplines. So I guess I was thinking about disciplines such as linguistics. So let's say corpus or computational linguistics, computer sciences. I've done quite a bit of work myself with computer scientists, statisticians, and that kind of thing. But the second kind of outreach that I was thinking about was with respect to exposing ourselves to new literatures beyond terrorism studies, and especially, I guess, I was thinking about internet studies. And I've always kind of wondered, I've reflected for quite a while on, you know, why we don't draw more in online extremism and terrorism research on the literature and on the research of our internet studies colleagues. And I quite like this quote that you see on the screen from the critical terrorism studies scholar, Richard Jackson, in his Unknown Knowns article from 2012. And basically, Jackson in that quote is sort of reflecting on why terrorism studies scholars don't draw more on sort of peace and conflict studies, security studies, and what have you. And I sort of reformulated Jackson's reformulation of Donny Rumsfeld, I guess, to think a bit about, okay, why have we also, not everybody, but why have we largely ignored the media and comms literature maybe, but in particular, why have we insufficiently engaged with the internet studies literature? So why is it that within terrorism studies research, where there's been such a surge of research on questions related to terrorism and the internet, especially social media, more recently messaging applications and what have you, but without reference to key scholars, existing studies of media and communication research, but in particular, internet studies. And I think this is there's even more of a question mark over this, if you like, given all the commonalities between terrorism studies and internet studies. And in fact, Martha Crenshaw in her keynote of yesterday mentioned that terrorism studies is really something that came about in a post 9/11 setting. It's not that people didn't study terrorism, obviously, prior to 9/11, but that this idea of a terrorism studies emerged almost immediately post 9/11. And actually the same is true. There's no sort of causation here, but the same is true actually of internet studies. And if you go online and you look either of these things up, what you'll see is that there's really a great many conferences and institutes and courses, MA courses in particular, but increasingly also undergraduate and other courses and modules and what have you in both terrorism studies on the one hand and internet studies on the other hand. And it's actually that kind of mass of activity that leads to this sort of institutionalization, if you like. The other thing that they have in common is they're both broadly, I would say, social scientific in their orientation. So while there is computing in internet studies, obviously, and now also in terrorism studies, we are broadly social scientists, I guess I would say. And so this literature, this internet studies literature, is easily knowable by us. It's certainly not as difficult to grapple with as, for example, if we begin to read, for example, the computer science literature, that kind of thing. And of course, a core feature of studies in inverted commas is indeed interdisciplinarity. And so there's lots of overlaps in that respect also. In fact, I guess in terms of this why question, why haven't we drawn on internet studies, literature and research to the extent that we might? Well, I would say actually it probably goes to another core feature, if you like, of studies, which is that they're subject specific. The whole point of studies, terrorism studies, internet studies, gender studies, women's studies, cultural studies, etc., right, is in fact to bring people together most of the time social scientists in a interdisciplinary setting to grapple with something subject specific, right? And so in terrorism studies, it's terrorism. In internet studies, unsurprisingly, it's the internet. And I guess the issue here is that when we have come to the internet, we come to it via terrorism studies, right? And so that, I think, is something that's quite important. Martha Crenshaw and I didn't confer on any of this beforehand, but nevertheless, I think there's quite a nice segue here then between her reflections of day one on inspired and strategic terrorism and mine here, because I think she was talking about the possibility of, you know, how those things can be viewed as separate or the ways in which they potentially interact. And I also think that there is a great many avenues for interaction between terrorism studies on the one hand and internet studies on the other hand. But like Martha was also pointing out yesterday, thinking about these things thinking about extremism and terrorism online from these different perspectives is potentially quite a useful way to go. And so that's why I think it's definitely useful for us to ask ourselves what terrorism studies can learn from internet studies. And I guess at the very highest level, as I think I've already been pointing to, this involves us taking the internet or online seriously, maybe more seriously, if you like, than we generally do in online extremism and terrorism research, which might sound a little odd, but I hope people understand what I'm getting at. I would say even privileging the internet, if you like, rather than privileging extremism and terrorism, which I think most of us are inclined to do generally. I don't want to remain, though, at this kind of abstract level of discussion. What I want to do is I want to throw out some ideas about where and how the internet studies literature could enrich our own research. I'm not going to talk about content so much tonight because I think in extremism and terrorism studies, when we think about online a lot of the time, we have a tendency to focus at that kind of what I consider to be a sort of mid-level, which is the content, right? I want to go down in one respect, drill down and ratchet up in another respect. So I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about micro level user practices, online user practices. And in particular, I'm just going to point to profile pictures here. Number two, I want to talk briefly about what I call mid-level concepts in research. And here I want to talk about online influencer or social media influencer research. And number three, I want to talk about the structural level. So the macro level internet structures or architectures. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to ideas about tech stacks. So let me quickly, if I can, sort of run through each of these and what I think they can sort of bring to bear for us. I will say something else very briefly here, which is that you know, one of the really important areas that I think we have begun to learn from internet researchers about is online research ethics. But I have talked about this elsewhere in recent times, and I've written about it quite recently also. I think we can definitely talk about it in the Q&A if people are interested, especially because I think we have something to contribute also in this respect. But let me focus on these three for my reflections here in my reflections here for the most part. So I wanted to start and talk about really micro level practices. And I think profile pictures are pretty interesting from this perspective. And I think it's accurate to say, please don't tell me that the Aussies are into yearbooks, but I don't think yearbooks are particularly popular or known outside of the United States, right? I don't think so. So for most people, profile pictures are emblematic of online culture, and especially of social media cultures, right? And they're ubiquitous across social media and also messaging applications. And they provide a window, I think it's fair to say, into both individual users, but also into larger online communities or larger online cultures or subcultures. And I think they have rightly been called one of the most telling pieces of self-disclosure or image construction online. There is a pretty extensive literature in internet research, not as extensive, I'm always surprised, as the internet research literature on selfies, but a fairly extensive literature on profile pictures. Not all of it is relevant, I think, to us. So online extremism and terrorism researchers, there's quite a lot of work, for example, about determining personality types and this kind of thing from profile pictures that I can't immediately discern having a great resonance for us, if you like. But I definitely think that some of the work that's been done about profile pictures by internet researchers is definitely germane to online extremism and terrorism research. And just as zooming through some of the work that I think is relevant, well, there is work out there about using profile pictures to signal, one's commitments in online settings, and also about the generation of trust in conjunction with signaling around the use of profile pictures. Also work about constructing collective identity using profile pictures. And I think anybody who can remember, for example, the high point of jihadi, in particular, so-called Islamic State, Twitter, for example, will understand precisely how that played out, because at one time it was really very quick and very easy for anybody who was familiar with IS's online visual vernacular to find accounts on, for example, Twitter, just by scrolling through and looking for appropriate profile pictures. And if researchers were using it in this kind of way, of course, people within that community were using it in that way also, right? So they could immediately pick out ideological fellow travelers, if you like, via their profile pictures. Another interesting one, and about which there is a goodly amount of research in internet studies, is the use of what we might term overlays on profile pictures in, for example, post-attack campaigns. The one that sprung immediately to my mind was Je suis Charlie after the Paris attacks, but there are numerous other campaigns also. Not overlays per se, but also in this relevant in terms of this campaigning literature, if you like, is people may recall, for example, after the killing of IS's kind of media guru and quite high level all-round operative Al-Adnani in I guess it was August of 2016. IS were already being seriously impacted on Twitter by takedown activity, but anybody who was online at around the time it came to be known that he had been killed, could see a wave of IS users changing their profile pictures to pictures of Al-Adnani, for example. And so there is extensive work out there about precisely this kind of campaigning using profile pictures that I think has a relevance to online extremism and terrorism researchers. Certainly, I think we could usefully compare, do some comparative work in terms of profile pics and selection and choices across ideologies. So the similarities and the differences. Also, if we're talking about comparative work, I think we could usefully do some cross-platform analysis to determine if users use the same or different pics for the different audiences that we assume are trafficking different platforms. And there is good internet research about, in inverted commas, everyday users or normal users, or however you'd like to think about the mass of users about precisely these issues. Another body of work about the gendering of profile pictures is commonplace, and I think we could usefully think that through in the context of extremist online spaces. And again, changes in profile picture selection decisions over time. And the one that springs immediately to mind in our area, I would say, is the way in which we can trace changes in profile pictures by users in especially jihadi online spaces over time in order to interfere with or to slow down takedown activities. So whereby once upon a time, their IS supporters on major social media platforms had very explicit profile pictures that were supportive of so-called Islamic State. Over time, they came to learn that this only hastened their takedown, and so they went to much more innocuous profile pictures, for example. And I think there's interesting questions about, the takedown activity that we've witnessed, particularly in 2021 in the wake of the events on Capitol Hill in the US. And so I guess an interesting contemporary question is, can we see similar changes in decision-making around profile picture selection within other, for example, extreme right spaces and amongst extreme right users. Other sort of micro online cultural practices that we could explore in similar kinds of ways that we could explore the literature that's been produced in internet studies and its applicability in extremism and terrorism research. I would say usernames, which I'm going to actually talk about in a panel later on today, Australia time, and I guess tomorrow morning for us. Emojis, and I'm always interested to hear if people can think of, a variety of other sort of micro online cultural practices that are relevant. Number two, I wanted to shift from the micro level, still with a focus on users now, but to sort of more mid-level research, if you like. And I thought it was interesting that, again, yesterday in her keynote address, Martha spoke to influencers, and she used the term influencer with respect to, for example, Anders Breivik and the Christchurch attacker and others. And I think there's definitely, it's definitely worth us familiarizing ourselves with the quite large amount of literature that's been produced in internet research about precisely online influencers or social media influencers, if you like. And this work addresses conceptual issues, which I think is interesting and relevant to us. So really basic questions like, who's an influencer. Also ideas about micro influencers versus what we might term celebrity or macro or even mega influencers, for example. And for many years now, I've reflected on, our close online connections. And there's a lot of work out there in internet research about precisely micro-influencing. In other words, our close online connections oftentimes can influence us to a greater extent than more remote connections, including, for example, say celebrity influencers and that kind of thing, because we tend to trust people closer to us, for example. And so I think this is an interesting one to think about in the context of online radicalization, because a lot of the time, I think when we think about online radicalization, we think about users being radicalized, arising out of consumption of content, so-called Islamic State content, for example, or extreme right content, or what have you, networking around that content, but largely with people who are unknown to those users, except in an online setting, for example. But it's interesting to think about online influence in the context of people we may also have connections to in inverted commas, real life settings. And I guess what I'm thinking about here, for example, is young people who traveled to join so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, for example, and influenced other people who they were already connected to in real life to travel later, but based on these kind of online interactions. So this is kind of a kind of micro-influencing, if you like, that's taking place online. Is it online radicalization is, I think, an interesting question. Martha spoke briefly yesterday about sort of seeking influencer status via stunts. I would say is something that's broadly known of, but the kind of stunt in inverted commas that's undertaken by extremists is to engage in attacks, right? And then there's also interesting questions about achieving a sort of a posthumous influencer status, if you like. One of the other important things I think a focus on social media influencer research draws our attention to is the business of extremism, because quite a lot of that research is about marketing. It's about social media influencers as marketers. And I would say this is probably the biggest segment of the literature is precisely about influencer marketing. Interesting questions too arising when we begin to think about influencer marketing around personal branding on the one hand versus group branding on the other hand. Some of you may remember in, I guess, the mid-2000s, there was a fair body of work that appeared that was precisely about Al-Qaeda and their sort of online branding activity, their use of logos and what have you. A focus on social media influencers is, like Martha was pointing to yesterday, it's much more about individuals, right? So it's about developing personal brands and that kind of thing. That's interesting to think about. Less, I guess, I would say, in the context of jihadism and more probably in the context of extreme right users, some of whom are definitely, I think, fall into the category of, you know, celebrity type influencers. And then an obvious question is, what, if anything, can social media influencer research tell us about doing online P/CVE, for example? Other similar online practices, other sort of similar type, what I'm calling sort of mid-level practices and attended literatures that have been produced by internet researchers. There's great work out there on online fandom, which I think is something interesting to think about across the spectrum of violent extremisms and terrorism. So across the ideological spectrum, if you like. Also, great work on online subcultures and what have you. Perhaps some of you can point us to other areas and other literatures you think might be worth exploring there also. And then the third thing I wanted to point to, and like I say, was sort of ratcheting things up and focusing on more macro level. So on structural factors, and I guess the kind of structures that we could think about and talk about are sort of economic type structures, so capitalist structures, if you like, what we might call the platform economy, but also platform architectures and what have you. And with respect to these, I wanted to draw your attention to tech stacks. And there's at least two kinds of tech stacks that I think are probably relevant to us as online extremism and terrorism researchers. The first is a tech stack, if you like, which is sort of the combination of tools and technologies, generally some combo of programming languages, frameworks, libraries, servers, software, and what have you, used by individuals or organizations to build, for example, web or mobile applications, or just even really, it's begun to be used more generally, even to talk about, the tech stack, the academic tech stack, for example, or, some companies' tech stack. What are the tools and technologies that are used within academia or within X company or what have you. But then there's what you might term the tech stack, okay? And what we're basically referring to here is the kind of the layers of actors and entities that actually account for the continued working of the internet itself. So this includes everything, I would say, from cloud service providers to content delivery networks, so CDNs, domain registrars, ISPs, up to, if you like, the government / sort of telecom infrastructures. The table that's on your screen right now is modified from work done by Joan Donovan in 2019. And what she was trying to think through was content moderation within tech stacks, the internet tech stack, if you like. And what she pointed out was that, when we talk about content moderation, we're mostly focused on layers 1 and 2 there. So the open web, but in particular, the terms of service, the community guidelines and what have you of, a variety of social media platforms, search engines, messaging applications, and what have you. But actually, the internet is made up of a whole variety of other less obvious, but really equally, if not more important, service providers. And actually, as an aside, this concept of the online ecosystem, I think, is a really worthwhile one that has begun to be fleshed out in online extremism and terrorism research more recently. And Stevan and his colleagues, for example, have a neat piece about far-right online ecosystems in which they try and, conceptualize it to a greater extent than it has been at the present time. But one of the things that an ecosystem approach, I think, could bring us to, if we dig deep enough, is to precisely these kinds of sort of backbone types, services and tools and what have you. And I think these are important to look at, and we can look at them from a lot of different perspectives, but one of them is definitely about their content moderation. Really, a really simple question about whether some of these services actually engage in content moderation or not. So there's a kind of a basic yes/no question here. But also when they do, if they do, when they do, you know, what is influencing their decision making, but also what are the pros and cons of these kinds of services actually being engaged in content moderation at all. Probably the one that people will be most familiar with in terms of having engaged in this debate or contributed to this debate is Cloudflare. Cloudflare is most well known probably for providing DDoS protection against DDoS attacks. They're basically providing security to about 25 million different websites at the present time. And immediately in the wake of the Charlottesville rally, they took a decision for the first time ever to refuse service to the Daily Stormer. And they have an interesting blog post that's worth reading for anybody who hasn't already done so, about their concerns that they actually could make this decision, and really it was down to the owner of the company, Matthew Prince. He just decided that he would, after some issues and what have you, that he would just take this decision. And anybody who's aware that in August all of the Taliban's websites went down, if you look at the media reporting, you'll see that most people assume that Cloudflare refused service to the Taliban at that point also, though they actually haven't clarified whether they did or not. But the websites were taken down. My point here is that there are a whole range of these other services that we generally haven't paid attention to from an online extremism and terrorism perspective, but that are very powerful potentially going forward with respect to decision making about what websites stay up and what websites come down. And there's a whole variety of questions then that stem from that powerfulness. So one of the other things that I think internet studies researchers do to a greater extent than ourselves is pay attention precisely to these sort of structural factors and draw attention to some of these wider issues. So just to conclude, some concluding thoughts, I guess. Like I already pointed to, I think what us drawing to a greater extent on the internet studies literature can do for us is to introduce us to different angles, if you like, on online extremism and terrorism that, as I've already said, sort of privilege the internet to a greater extent than we might be inclined to do coming from a terrorism studies perspective, which privileges the terrorism. It's not an either or choice, of course. The best work, I think, doubtless is going to reside somewhere in the middle. So it'll take extremism and terrorism research and internet research seriously. And just to ratchet things up another level, I guess what I would say is that, because I know this isn't an online extremism and terrorism conference, it's an extremism and terrorism conference, and it's not all about online. I think there are other relevant studies and their literatures that we could definitely usefully draw from within terrorism studies. And so when we're thinking about women, for example, in terrorism, and there definitely are colleagues who've drawn from women's studies and feminist studies and what have you. If we're thinking about ideas about masculinity or hypermasculinity or what have you, certainly gender studies. There's great work that has emerged over the last number of years on, for example, jihadi culture, including online jihadi culture. drawing on cultural studies. And if we begin to think about sort of also methodological approaches, there's great work too in, for example, visual studies that I think we could draw on. So that's where I just wanted to leave it. I want to thank everybody for your time and your attention. And I'm interested to hear what you have to contribute on some of these issues also.
Well, thank you so much, Maura. I mean, I really don't think I can express just how much you're able to pack into that presentation, you know, not just in terms of scope, but in terms of the depth as well with your case studies. I mean, to go all the way from the profile pictures and emojis and so on at the micro level, through to the meso level and influences and the cultural, societal aspect of the internet, all the way up to those structural ecosystems in one keynote. I think it really it makes it clear to us all just how much scope there is for, you know, future exciting research frontiers in understanding the relationship between digital architectures and environments and extremisms of all forms. You know, and there are so many questions we could ask. And I imagine that in some ways, you know, for me, when I think about it, you know, one of the reasons maybe that terrorism studies has not had the time to perhaps, you know, focus deeply on some of these other fields might be because of the fast-paced nature of our field.
Yes.
You know, in a sense, we've been reacting to emergencies for the last 10 years or more.
Yep.
You know, particularly ISIS and now the far right, and they kind of come and go, and we just catch up with ourselves, and then another one sort of comes. But
Yeah.
I imagine, yeah, now might be the time.
Absolutely. Sorry to interrupt you, Julian. That was an absolutely agreed. And you know, I had lots of things I wanted to address, you know, and I had to cut a lot of stuff out. You'll be astounded to learn. But one of them was definitely to say, absolutely agreed with your observation there, that I think, yes, that we are always sort of firefighting, and that's one of the reasons why, and because a lot of the time we think about things also around attacks and whatnot. This also causes us always to be focused on the terrorism aspect, even when we're interested in online, and so I think that's definitely a factor. Agreed.
And so despite that, I mean, is there anything that you have seen or can think of that internet or media and communication studies could learn from the research that has been done in terrorism studies and from this firefighting, as you say?
Yeah, so one of the things that I definitely think where we have something useful to contribute is precisely actually in this area of ethics. Now, like I said, we're super late to the whole ethics issue, you know. The Association of Internet Researchers produced their first ethics guidelines in 2002. So immediately post 9/11, as it were, so 20 years ago. And one of the motivating factors of the conference is post 9/11 and the 20 years and what have you. Well, internet researchers were already thinking about ethics issues to the extent that they had them worked out enough to actually produce a guideline, the first one that they produced in 2002. We managed to do a special issue on ethics and terrorism in 2021. I definitely think we have more work to do on ethics. But having said that, I feel like one of the things that we've really begun to grapple with, especially online extremism and terrorism researchers in the last number of years, is this whole issue of researcher welfare. And actually, I do think that we have important contributions to make in that area, and people have already made definitely worthwhile contributions, and I think we can do sort of more and better, if you like, in that area. So that's kind of the first thing that pops into my mind, with respect to us, you know, making a really worthwhile contribution to internet studies, let's say.
Yeah, and I would wager that's also a good place to be making a contribution as well, you know, in the ethical domain.
Agreed.
Now, I'm going to ask a question from Michele, privilege of chair of the conference. Michelle's written through in the chat section, drawing attention to the very heavily textual nature, of the online data that we often work with. And Michelle's asked, this online data that is textual is very rich with imagery, with videos. Do you have any suggestions for how researchers can expand their methodologies to incorporate non-textual online data? For instance, I think you mentioned that in your last slide, that there was, usefulness in semiotics, for instance. Oh, and I should just clarify, Absolutely. That was actually from Lydia, not Michele.
Thanks, Lydia. That's a great question. Agree. So I absolutely agree. So I think we missed the visual turn. A lot of this is about us missing stuff. It's a definite us in all of this. It's not me sort of standing outside and shaking my finger. It has to be said. Again, it's at least 20 years and probably more since ours is much more recent, but I think it's definitely occurring. So for a long time there wasn't a lot of work in terrorism research broadly, or indeed in online extremism and terrorism research that focused on visuals, but colleagues have done great work, I think, on images in the jihadi magazines, on jihadi videos, for example, on far-right memes, and a whole variety of non-text content, both still images and moving images. And there's no question that it is tricky. I mostly talked about, drawing ideas from the internet studies literature and from internet studies research tonight. But actually, I think we could absolutely usefully look at it and think through the methodologies that have been employed in internet studies, including work on visuals. And I absolutely think we could usefully draw on that also. And I did mention visual studies, and I also feel like we could, anybody who is interested in online visuals and what have you, there's really great work out there in visual studies where a whole variety of contributors have really thought deeply about the theory, the analysis of visuals, both from a sort of, conceptually and whatnot, and also from a methodological perspectives. And I absolutely will point colleagues to that visual studies literature. It's hugely useful, I think, to us going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much of the internet is not text. It's
correct.
Imagery and video and song and so on as well. We miss a lot of that, don't we, when we just
absolutely
text. Look, a lot of praise is coming in, Maura, on the Q&A function. Just people are saying your talk is one of the best they've heard in 10 years from Sydney Jones. Others are thanking you and just saying great as always. You're really getting a fan reaction here. But I'm going to ask a question from Kurt. It's similar, actually. It's around methodologies rather, I think, than big picture scope. And he's asking, are there any specific subfields within internet studies that you'd be keen to see us connect with? And he's suggesting that researchers looking at problematic internet use, also researchers focusing on individual psychological responses to online stimuli, could both be useful in understanding radicalisation processes. And he's asking if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Thanks, Kurt, for that. Yes, I think there's quite a lot of work that's that's been put out there by internet researchers. There's this online harms bill, for example, in the UK, and there's a lot of good and interesting work actually about that, because it addresses the gamut of harms, including actually extremism and terrorism. But setting aside that particular bit of legislation or what have you, there is very good work about a whole variety of online harms, in fact, that I think would be useful to us. Everything from, for example, online child sex abuse, to, for example, the roles of the internet in domestic violence type activities, sexual violence, and that kind of thing. There's really just a whole gamut. The whole gamut of online harms have been addressed by internet researchers. And again, I absolutely think that some of that research has direct relevance to our own work, because it's broadly in this harms area. So obviously there's similarities, but there's differences. But you know, I think it would definitely be useful for us to grapple with it. And the other thing I would say, there's an interesting new. I was just put in mind by Kurt's question of it. There's an interesting new journal out of, I think, Stanford University in the US. It's this Journal of Online Trust and Safety, and from what I can gather from sort of the first issue that's really just appeared in the last week or so, is that they're interested in precisely this spectrum of online harms. And in particular, I guess, responses, potential responses to them. So, you know, I think there are a growing number of venues for publishing research, you know, that is precisely in this kind of sweet spot between internet studies and extremism and terrorism. Also, we haven't gotten into it here, but work about, say, hate and disinfo, misinfo, conspiracy, etc. So we're back again to this broader category of online harms.
Yeah.
In which I think we fit.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as the boundaries start to blur into areas.
Correct.
Of disinformation or conspiracy theories, as we discussed yesterday. So another question's come in from Stuart, and it's sort of circling back to the point we made before about the non-textual nature of much, you know, of what we see online. And Stuart's asking, what do you consider the role of online music, video clips, gaming communities, you know, in radicalization and recruitment, and particularly, you know, the line between art and free speech, and the ability, I imagine, also to conceal material in non-textual form. And we did discuss that yesterday also in terms of fiction and the far right, you know, concealing that really radical stuff in an area that's not textual. Yeah,
this is a great kind of a series of observations, if you like, quick observations that have been put to me there. I guess I think audio is interesting and really understudied. And this is everything from, there is work definitely out there about music, obviously, both music in extremist and terrorism scenes, but also obviously a massive literature about music online and what have you, and it's all different aspects of it. But, you know, it's not just about music. I guess I would say another type of audio that is really important in, for example, the extreme right, and again, really understudied, is podcasts. You know, and there is a lot of work in internet research broadly about podcasting and what have you that is doubtless relevant. I have been, I think there has been good work that's been undertaken. Egghammer and his colleagues have done great work about sort of jihadi culture that actually does take in things like nasheed, so music, as it were, that takes into account poetry, that takes into account some other sort of cultural artifacts, if you like. And so I think that's definitely work that has been useful and that we could definitely expand upon going forward. So sort of, online cultures across ideologies online. This question about, art and free speech and what have you, this is something obviously that's really tricky for me. Sam Jackson actually on Twitter the other day reminded me of something that I bring up sometimes, and I scratch my head a little and I wonder, am I missing something? But for example, on the one hand, you have people talking about censorship, and on the other hand, I guess from my own perspective, I have a tendency to talk about regulation. And for me, one of the issues that arises is what's the difference? And is it just is that just a politics, or what have you? For me, my personal feeling would be that we need to regulate on the one hand. And as I think I've said before in various settings, in Europe, regulation is something that's widespread, not just with respect to online, but across the board. Regulation is something that people generally favor, if you like. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, it is very difficult to regulate for online harms. This is definitely an area that is fraught with difficulty, and I think we're probably going to make some serious boo-boos before we figure out, good, legitimate ways forward. But again, I do think that this is something that we could more explicitly pay attention to in our own area. So speak more directly to questions of freedom of speech, censorship, regulation, sort of legislative ways forward, and what have you. There is definitely people working. So there are lawyers and others who have contributed, and I just saw another interesting paper that was published in the last couple of days about, for example, European Union activity in this area in a law review. But I think we definitely need to bring those discussions into the mix in terrorism studies also.
Yeah. Now, Maura, we've only got three minutes or so left, and I'm going to make a hard swing now and ask you a question about counterterrorism. And this question is from Michele. And Michelle's asked, given the importance of multimodal analysis and intersection of technology and culture in analysing online extremism, what do counterterrorism strategies need to learn from this in their models and their approaches?
Yeah, an easy question from Michele for the last 3 minutes. I liked and I was interested to hear Martha yesterday actually sort of pointing to the way in which we have a tendency when we think about what she termed inspired terrorism to seek to address it. So when we think about counterterrorism measures, we think about different counterterrorism measures when we think about inspired terrorism versus more strategic type terrorism. And for me, I guess because I always revert to questions about online and the internet, I thought, yeah, I mean, that makes a certain amount of sense because I guess the assumption is that a lot of this inspiring, a lot of this influencing is taking place online. Not only online, absolutely agreed, but online is definitely playing a significant role, and probably a greater role over time. And I guess when you think about these two things together, it's relatively unsurprising then that because we think about the internet in certain ways, and we think about discourses and narratives and strategic comms and what have you, then if you're going to engage in online counterterrorism, as it were, that would make up a big component of it as well. Though it has to be said that if we really begin to think about things, we do know that, for example, there has been a lot of sort of hacking type activity that has taken place also. Some of it is more grassroots in its orientation, so anonymous type activity, if you like. Some of it is definitely state-backed hackers and what have you that have taken down, for example, even going back some years, jihadi forums and that kind of thing. And we also know that I talked about Al-Adnani, for example, that, you know, media personalities and others who were prominent figures, again, even going quite back in time, also prominent figures within both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State's media outlets and what have you, have also been targeted in real world settings. So it does actually run the gamut when we think about online, and then when we think about online counterterrorism. The countering of online terrorism hasn't just taken place in online settings. So it isn't all about narratives and, you know, and what have you. So I guess I've jumped that one a little bit. But actually, I think it's definitely something worth thinking through to a greater extent also. So we've talked a lot about online extremism and terrorism this evening from more of a user approach, and then also the online structures, internet structures, and what have you. But I think we could usefully also think some more about online counterterrorism.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we could actually talk all morning about this. We've got more questions coming through on the Q&A. Really more, it just gives us more incentive to have you back down in Australia sometime soon. And I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say we hope we do see you here again sooner rather than later. And an enormous thank you from everybody for your presentation this morning. It's been absolutely fantastic. We're now going to have a 10-minute break, slightly less than 10 minutes now, 7 or 8 minute break, before we're going to follow on really from some of Maura's themes and start our next session, which is going to be looking at extremist online ecosystems. So I look forward to seeing you there.
Thanks, everybody.